to James Baldwin, God's Revolutionary Voice podcast, brought to you by the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. We would like to remind everybody who's watching us, and thank you for that, that the next event as part of the Year of Baldwin celebrations in Philadelphia is coming up, and we would like everybody to come and attend it. And even if you can't, we will be live streaming it for you to watch at home. With that, I would like to introduce our guests for today, Jahan Chaudhry, Emily Dong, and Crystal Sang. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us today for our fourth episode of the podcast. And Emily here is one of the core organizers of the event that we're going to be having next week. So I would like to begin by asking her if she would like to say something about the event and give us a few details.
Thanks for the introduction, Shantanu. Yeah, like you said, this coming Thursday and Saturday is the second event as part of the year of James Baldwin, God's Revolutionary Voice. It's a 2-day event, and April 4th is the 57th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. And so almost 60 years later, we in Philadelphia, as part of the year, James Baldwin, are going to listen to his whole speech, Beyond Vietnam, and basically both honor King in full appreciation of his life and sacrifice, and also in particular his speech and what he imbues the people of America today, what revolutionary task that is unfinished that he began that we must finish. And this relates to James Baldwin because James Baldwin saw Martin Luther King Jr. as the father of a new nation, if there is to be a new nation. And so the first day, April 4th, we'll play the whole speech, Beyond Vietnam, followed by a panel discussion talking about what a time to break silence looks like today and what it means today, if there is to be a revolutionary future for America. And that will be at the First Unitarian Church from 5 to 8 p.m., which you can find on our website, yearofjamesbaldwin.org. And then the second day will be from 12 to 6 p.m., and that will continue talking about the sacrifice of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and legacy that he gives the young generation today. And we'll have a roundtable called A Generation Prepared to Pay Its Dues to the Future. And it's talking about the price that we as Americans today have, both what we owe Martin Luther King Jr., but also what we must do in order to face our own government, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And then we'll end the whole event with intercivilizational cultural performances, Korean drumming, Cambodian dance, and some jazz groups, ensembles, including Alfie Pollett and Bobby Zinkle and the Warriors of the Wonderful Sound, to talk about how there's one thing left that we, the American people, have lost along the way, and that is the human being. And so what does it mean to inject humanity back into our civilization? So that's the 2-day event. The Saturday event is at Zion Baptist Church, which we're really excited to be at. And it's a historic church that the Reverend Leon Sullivan, who was a big part of the civil rights movement, in particular in Philadelphia. And so we're really grateful to be allowed in there. And like you mentioned, Shantanu, both days will be live streamed for all of our friends who participate in the Saturday Free School and have been following the Year of James Baldwin online.
We entitled this episode, I Have Seen the Promised Land, because, well, it's kind of posing all of us a certain question. Why Martin Luther King Jr.? Especially in the Year of Baldwin, but why Martin Luther King Jr. for our time? And we do want to say that it is a happy Easter, and it's significant in its own way, because as we know, if Jesus had died for us, we can also recognize that Martin Luther King died for us and our future. And with Martin Luther King, will we be able to be connected to a certain quality that makes us all truly, in a sense, searching for our own identity, or what it means to be really American, what it means to really be a people, a part of the world, and not working as though we are like had Emily said, a purveyor of violence in the world, discussing basically what it means for nonviolence as a philosophical framework of the human mind, how that quality had affected the American people. Um, and we wanted to talk about how it is through Martin Luther King that the moral standard of the 21st century can actualize itself, and how that moral standard doesn't or isn't erased just because the ruling elite wanted to. And we wanted to discuss specifically where do we go with Martin Luther King and not without Martin Luther King. Um,
Yeah, and that, I'm still thinking about what you said. That was very beautifully put. Um, but today, for today's episode, we are going to be reading excerpts from James Baldwin's essay, "The Dangerous Road Before Martin Luther King." And along with that, we're also going to be listening to certain clips of the Beyond Vietnam speech. And as Emily mentioned, we're going to be showing the whole speech on April 4th, but today we're going to only listen to certain excerpts. And I believe that this is very important because in this speech, King gave a warning to the American people for that time, but that warning is also extremely relevant today. And um, you can actually see that not only was it a warning, but it was also extremely prophetic, because the crisis that we find ourselves today, he predicted when he gave this speech 57 years ago. And as is Martin Luther King's way, he doesn't only end with a warning, he has a message of peace, a message of hope for the American people, and a method to how to get there. And in this speech, he says that America's soul was being poisoned, and Vietnam was one of the reasons why America's soul was being poisoned. And we had to collectively throw that poison out. We had to resuscitate America's soul. And King was extremely um, invested in the soul of America more than anything. And he said that um, this war in Vietnam, if America did not change its ways, did not follow the path of light, it wouldn't end with Vietnam. It would go beyond Vietnam. And it has, as we have seen, gone into Cambodia, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, and we're currently in the midst of two full scale wars in Ukraine and in Palestine. So what can we do about that? In that question is exactly what we're trying to answer. And Martin Luther King tries to call upon the American people, saying that, hey, this is what is necessary, and this is what you'll have to give. This is what is necessary, and this is what you'll have to sacrifice. And this speech is extremely relevant, and you can look back at history and see that all these major newspapers, even a lot of influential people that were close to King, criticized this speech. They said that it was this analysis of connecting war with civil rights and the black struggle. It wasn't it was too simplistic, and it actually was a step backward in his cause, in his fight for civil rights and the black struggle. But King held firm. He went everywhere before the Vietnam speech, after the Vietnam speech. He went everywhere and said the same thing. He was morally consistent in that way, and in doing so, he actually told us that um, if you can stand up, do what is right, America will follow the path that will lead to history remembering it as a civilization of peace and not a civilization of war. And so this This speech extremely relevant even today, and with the year of Baldwin, we feel like it is necessary for us to hear him speak about it. So we will hear the first clip right now from Martin Luther King Jr.'s Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence.
I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice. I join you in this meeting because I'm in deepest agreement with the aims and work of the organization which has brought us together, clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. The recent statements of your executive committee are the sentiments of my own heart, and I found myself in full accord when I read its opening lines. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. Moreover, when the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do in the case of this dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty. But we must move on. Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony. But we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision. But we must speak. And we must rejoice as well, for surely this is the first time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Perhaps a new spirit is rising among us. If it is, let us trace its movements and pray that our own inner being may be sensitive to its guidance, for we are deeply in need of a new way beyond the darkness that seems so close around us. Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask. And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I'm nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live. In the light of such tragic misunderstanding, I deem it of signal importance to try to state clearly, and I trust concisely, why I believe that the path from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, a church in Montgomery, Alabama, where I began my pastorate, leads clearly to this sanctuary tonight. I come to this platform tonight to make a passionate plea to my beloved nation.
Yeah, we wanted to bring up that clip in particular because of a lot of reasons that we'll get into. But to start, there's something in King that is very similar to how I feel like maybe we all feel to a certain extent. When he talks about that a calling to speak is a vocation of agony, he's saying similarly that I know the cost of speaking, of standing for what is right. That tells me, as somebody listening to Martin Luther King, who isn't alive now, and maybe our time is different also, but that there is something called truth. There is something called right. That is a moral standard. And he says, you know, even if you don't know everything or you have to speak with the humility appropriate to a limited vision, you still speak on what is right. And that what I mean by a new quality of King is also something that he said when he said that a new spirit rising among us, let us chase its movements and its inner workings and have the inner workings of its movements, have us be sensitive to it and to its guidance. I felt that it's a specific connection between the soul and the person, or the heart and the mind, or whatever it is, to really follow what King was able to follow, his path between Dexter to Riverside that was almost preordained, or even to know that you can't have peace at home and have war abroad. They don't mix. And something about the spirit, not saying something that is ephemeral, but something about the human being is also qualitatively changed when you are also accepting that your conscience leads you no other choice but to speak for what is right. And that's why we start with saying that King is a revolutionary. We know that he is, and there are justifications for him to be otherwise. So I just wanted to start there.
Yeah, I felt the same way as you, Serafina, the things that you emphasized, because I think we've all listened to this speech a bunch of times, and it almost sounds pretty shallow or corny to say this, but every time you listen, we listen to what, 2 minutes, 3 minutes of that speech, and there's already so much going on, and it makes you really appreciate King the philosopher, King the thinker, King the speaker and writer, but then, like you said, King the revolutionary, and also King the genius, because this time, like what you said about speaking to be a vocation of agony, the thing that I really picked up on is what you mentioned later about him talking with the spirits of history, and may our inner being be sensitive to the spirit of history already moving forward, because it's actually very optimistic. Like King is, despite the crisis, the war in Vietnam, the toll it's taking on the Vietnamese and American soldiers sent to Vietnam who can't even live in the same neighborhood in America, he's very optimistic about there's a spirit in history moving forward, because people in the world and in our own country will always be grasping for freedom, like that forward movement of history. And may our spirits be, and may we be sensitive to this development, this advancement of human beings who will always be looking to be free. And like, may we join the rest of the world's people, and like in some ways the tides of history. But the other thing I wanted to just add into what you're saying, Serafina, is I really like the way King talks about the mandates of conscience. Like this thing that there is such thing as a higher law than earthly law. Like there is, you called it truth, but there is such thing as a mandate of conscience, not just an earthly mandate, but a higher law, a higher mandate that demands something of all of us and also allows us to achieve something more than what we're used to. And what, like, you don't have to accept what is on earth, but in fact, you look for and you strive for, and instead you reach for that higher mandate of conscience that demands you to do things beyond maybe what you even observe or what's the status quo or what you are usually used to conforming to. And like I said, I just wanted to add one last point because, again, we listened to what, 2 minutes, 3 minutes of what's an hour speech. And it's just really deep and sophisticated the way King makes a point, like you said, that for all those people who say civil rights and peace don't mix, how does that make sense? Like there's something very dangerous, something very key about putting together the struggle for civil rights and the struggle for peace, which is to say the struggle for democracy in America, for the struggle for real, full people's democracy in America, and the struggle for democracy in the world. And it reminded me of James Baldwin, especially because this is the year of James Baldwin. The way James Baldwin said, you can never have full democracy or full civil rights in America unless there's peace in the world. You can't have peace in America unless there's peace in the world, because what this society, what the ruling elite, what the white world does not understand about Vietnam or even the whole world, which doesn't abide by the Western way of life, the American way of life, white standards, is what they also don't realize about Sambo here in America. That Sambo in America is not happy. And the Vietnamese do not follow the American way of life either. Like there are peoples around the world who do not think America is actually the best, who would not trade their own culture, their own civilization, their own like independent desire to determine their own destiny. They will not let America determine their country the same way that here in America, the people are not happy with the direction, the way the country's going. And I find that really deep because I think, like Shantanu, you were saying, that's something very relevant for today's times. And that's why I think we're really looking forward to like listening to the whole speech and discussing what it means today, this Thursday at our event.
Yeah. Really quickly, I just wanted to add to what Emily was saying, that civil rights, like peace at home, cannot be achieved without peace abroad. And I think that King was extremely conscious of the fact that racism and white supremacy is one of the sort of structural, it forms a structural framework of war abroad. And it's the same thing that causes discrimination here at home. And it causes so many people to live in homelessness and poverty. And when you see that the structure is the same, then you can really begin to grasp that you can't have one without having the other. And yeah, I just wanted to add that he made this connection extremely apparent and clear.
Yeah, because also, oh, sorry, Jahan.
Yeah.
No, it's okay.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what Emily was saying, and just in terms of the significance of what he's saying here. I mean, as he mentions, he talks about it being a vocation of agony, because this was something that he was very, very difficult to do. I mean, in some ways, it might maybe easy in hindsight to see, to not fully appreciate, because as he mentions in a very humble way, he talks about, I had to come to terms with the betrayal of my own silence over the past 2 years. And, he was, this is in 1967. The U.S. Basically escalates its involvement in Vietnam after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1965. This group, Clergy and Laity Concerned, which invited him to give this speech, I think had been one of the early groups to protest the war, and was made up of Christian and Jewish clergy. And so he's saying, I'm in total agreement with their cause. And as Emily was saying, when he's discussing this new spirit rising among the people, he's saying among the clergy here, but also among the people. And, this is one of the significant things that I'm sure we'll talk about today with King, is that he understood the people. And so while at the same time he was under tremendous pressure from the political establishment, from many of his own advisors and others who were funding the SCLC, he understood that this new spirit was rising. And one thing I was particularly struck by this time listening to it was the part where he's describing the responses that people were giving him to prevent him from coming out. And he says, at the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask. And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my regret. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live. And I was struck in particular by that last line. Their questions suggest they do not know the world in which they live. And I think that's a very profound statement, because he's saying that all along, as I've understood the world, it has been on this human principle that, we are all connected, and injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere. And I've always seen civil rights through that perspective. And so you didn't know me at all if you think that I should not take this stand. And even more profoundly, that you do not know the world in which you live. And that also struck me as very Baldwinian. I mean, just before this, I was reading a talk to teachers, and earlier I was reading a letter to my nephew as well. And in both of those, he talks about the myths of white supremacy, and how that contributes to the U.S. role in the world. And here King is saying to these people that you may have good intentions, but you essentially are deluded by those same myths if you do not see how peace and civil rights mix. And so I was very struck by that.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was reading in Strength to Love the importance of forgiveness, either forgiving your enemy, and this is the whole, or he kind of is describing this thing about nonviolence and the qualities that go into it. But then again, with Jesus, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's the example that King used as almost the most highest example of, even on the cross when he was about to die, Jesus was not mad. He said, forgive. And similarly said, what that comment, Jahan, is, it means that there's a certain framing, a certain way to synthesize how you even refer to people. It's not as though people cannot learn about the world that they live in. He's not condemning people to ignorance, but instead he's saying we can learn about the world, and I can also help move forward. We can help move forward from this lack of knowing really what world is to come.
Yeah, Serafina, Jahan, I feel like both of you are like this connection between King and Baldwin, I think, is really, really important. And like, I think just like Baldwin, King draws this connection between the external world, like all the forces, everything that we're seeing, war, poverty, racism, and connects it to the internal world, into the private life of every single person, into the conscious of every single person that lives in America and lives in the world today. And what I find so moving about the speech and about King is that by engaging in this process of moral self-examination, you are engaging in essentially nonviolent revolutionary strategy. And like what King, why we call King the father of a new nation and the father of a new American people in particular, is that in this act of calling people to truly understand like their own human capacity, and also calling people to take up a new moral standard, it becomes like a deeply transformative force for not just the individual but for society at large. And so yeah, there really is no equivalency to King in my eyes, and it is because King possesses a certain moral authority that no other leader in America Black or white or in the world really. And yeah, there's no equivalent because, you know, he passes this litmus test that I think young people are constantly putting to elders, and that King actually lived according to the values that he preached. And in the act of doing that, he was able to give a certain gift to humanity and a certain legacy and tradition that we can now look to and we can now pick up.
I think that this actually goes back to our conversation last week where we were reading "They Can't Turn Back," and Baldwin sees and is a witness to this great student movement, and he mentions that what are these young people really looking for in the older generation, and I think it's exactly what King exemplifies, that you in simple terms, you talk the talk and you walk the walk, right? You do what you say that you believe in, and that is the only thing that gains you the trust of the young people. That's the only thing that makes them um, come to you or come to your cause when you call them. And that's precisely why. And I don't know if you mentioned, Emily, we're dedicating this event to James Reeb and Viola Liozzo, who were two civil rights activists who heeded King's call. When he called, they came. And I feel like this is exactly what is needed in a revolutionary, for people, the young people, to look at you and say, okay, I can trust this person. I believe that they will lead me to the promised land. And I feel like another thing that I was thinking about, based on what Jahan and even actually Emily got me thinking when you mentioned the mandate of consciousness, this higher power that's sort of calling on you. And Jahan mentioned that part where King says that those who are confused by my stance have not known me, my commitment, or my calling. And I feel like this is what he's talking about. This higher mandate of consciousness is calling from somewhere above. And King believed in a kind of a cosmic partnership between himself and a power above and the people. And he got his power from the people, and he got his power from his faith. And yeah, I mean, this conversation really makes me think that King is exactly what America deserved in that point in history, and it was extremely upsetting that what he started was cut short.
Yeah, what's interesting is King, something Jahan said that you're building on, Shantu, made me think a lot about why it's really moving for me to hear King in just those short minutes say that I, as a man, had to face my own, that perhaps I had taken too long to speak, and I had to find the courage to speak, because I think there's something really, it's like what Jahan said, where I think today it's easy to look back. We take it for granted. Like, we take it for granted the amount of courage it took for him to speak, but also, like Crystal said, the amount of moral self-examination it took for him to speak, knowing that first of all, knowing that as the leader of a movement, everything he says will be criticized, will weigh heavily on the people who he represents. And then to take a stand against the Vietnam War, he knows that he will be called, for example, anti-American, a communist. This is, I think, a few decades, maybe, I mean, it's at the heels of McCarthyism and everything that Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois had to face, in saying it is exactly because I love the people of America, especially my people, the African American people, that I must speak to even save, to redeem something in this country, save what I believe the potential of this country can be. And the reason why I really resonate with it too is because I think there's something also very moving about the fact that, and I know we might get into it later as well, but King, I think it's exactly that King is the descendant of an oppressed people. Like he's the descendant of an oppressed people, the most oppressed in America, that in some ways it's exactly because of what he gained from his history and like his people and an oppressed people, like, you know, Jesus and the disinherited, that gives him like this conscience where he's like, I have no choice but to speak. My conscience calls in it, but also I owe everyone before me. I owe the oppressed people of Vietnam. Like I owe humanity something and I must speak. And it's kind of that mandate of consciousness, that higher mandate. And the last thing I want to say is just about how I think it's important that King in some ways, like the son of an oppressed people, you don't take the earthly laws as seriously as you take the laws, higher laws, God's laws, like this mandate of consciousness, because you know that the earthly laws are unjust. And I just wanted to say that it really reminded me of, like, I actually think that kind of spirit that King has, it's a very humble human spirit that in some ways is extraordinary. That I think a lot of the poets, like in some ways it's what art, like the best art speaks of. And it reminded me of, I think it's one of Tagore's, I think it's actually one of Tagore's songs. It's one of the Indian freedom struggle songs. And I forget whether it's a national anthem, but I remember once someone sang it for me, where the lyrics are about the Indian freedom struggle, where they say, even if you have to walk the path alone, you walk. And even if it's dark, you take one of your ribs and you make it into a candle to find the path forward. And even when you're just the spirit of, even if it's you alone, you go forward because you're actually not alone. And you have to find a way because you may be a human being, but you obey a higher law meant for human beings to strive towards. And that's that mandate of consciousness. And yeah, Martin Luther King Jr., when you hear him speak, I think sometimes people today, you forget that he was a man. Like he was an ordinary man. He was a human being, flesh like us, bone like us. And there's something very extraordinary about the choices he made. And the more, like Serafina said, the moral standards that he almost extraordinarily, like in a non-human way, followed and strove towards. But that's
Yeah.
exactly the potential of the human being.
Yeah, I needed to hear that because I think when it gets down to it, like, I think the thing about bringing up King's calling, him having one, and also what you're saying, like all of our capacities, like the ability, what we are able to do, it's definitely a very personal and honest thing. Like there's something really deep about what it means to be a part of time, the time that is now, the time that is very, like you can see where you would want to go, like you would have a certain connection to creating something. But with that, I'd like to turn to Crystal reading James Baldwin's A Dangerous Road before Martin Luther King Jr. We have some selections picked out.
And Crystal, if you wouldn't mind reading it out.
I said that right.
Do
Yes, I did.
It's okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm having some issues. It's not showing up.
There we go.
All right. Can you see this?
Yep.
Okay. So we picked a few, like 4 excerpts from this essay to read today. And this first one is about King and the church. And specifically, it even goes into what differentiates King from other preachers. So I'll start reading now. I had never heard King preach, and I went on Sunday to hear him at his church. This church is a red brick structure with a steeple, and it directly faces, on the other side of the street, a white domed building. My notes fail to indicate whether this is the actual capital of the state or merely a courthouse, but the conjunction of the two buildings, the steepled one low and dark and tense, the domed one higher and dead, white and forbidding, sums up with an explicitness a set designer might hesitate to copy the struggle now going on in Montgomery. At that time in Montgomery, King was almost surely the most beloved man there. I do not think that one could have entered any of the packed churches at that time, if King was present, and not have felt this. Of course, I think that King would be loved by his congregations in any case, and there is always a large percentage of churchwomen who adore the young male pastor, and not always, or not necessarily, out of those grim, psychic motives concerning which everyone today is so knowledgeable. No, there was a feeling in this church which quite transcended anything I have ever felt in a church before. Here it was, totally familiar and yet completely new, the packed church, glorious with the Sunday finery of the women, solemn with the touching, gleaming sobriety of the men, beautiful with children. Here were the ushers, standing in the aisles in white dresses or in dark suits, with armbands on. People were standing along each wall, beside the windows, and standing in the back. King and his lieutenants were in the pulpit, young Martin, as I was beginning to think of him, in the center chair. When King rose to speak, to preach, I began to understand how the atmosphere of this church differed from that of all the other churches I have known. At first, I thought that the great emotional power and authority of the Negro church was being put to a new use, but this is not exactly the case. The Negro church was playing the same role which it has always played in Negro life, but it had acquired a new power. Until Montgomery, the Negro church, which has always been the place where protest and condemnation could be most vividly articulated, also operated as a kind of sanctuary. The minister who spoke could not hope to effect any objective change in the lives of his hearers, and the people did not expect him to. All they came to find, and all that he could give to them, was a sustenance for another day's journey. Now, King could certainly give his congregation that, but he could also give them something more than that, and he had. It is true that it was they who had begun the struggle of which he was now the symbol and the leader. It is true that it had taken all of their insistence to overcome in him a grave reluctance to stand where he now stood. But it is also true, and it does not happen often, that once he had accepted the place they had prepared for him, their struggle became absolutely indistinguishable from his own, and took over and controlled his life. He suffered with them, and thus he helped them to suffer. The joy which filled this church, therefore, was a joy achieved by people who have ceased to delude themselves about an intolerable situation, who have found their prayers for a leader miraculously answered, and who now know that they can change the situation if they will. And surely very few people had ever spoken to them as King spoke. King is a great speaker. The secret of his greatness does not lie in his voice or his presence or his manner, though. It has something to do with all these. Nor does it lie in his verbal range or felicity, which are not striking. Nor does he have any capacity for those stunning, demagogic flights of the imagination which bring an audience cheering to its feet. The secret lies, I think, in his intimate knowledge of the people he is addressing, be they black or white, and in the forthrightness with which he speaks of those things which hurt and baffle them. He does not offer any easy comfort, and this keeps his hearers absolutely tense. He allows them their self-respect. Indeed, he insists on it. This next excerpt is about Martin's father. Martin Sr. He is naturally very proud of Martin Jr., but he claims to be not at all surprised. He sacrificed to make himself ready, that is, for a trial or a series of trials, which might have been the undoing of a lesser man. Yet, though he is not surprised at the extraordinary nature of his son's eminence, he was surprised when, at college, Martin decided that he was called to preach. He had expected him to become a doctor or a lawyer because he always spoke of these professions as though he aspired to them. As he had, and since, as I have said, King is far from garrulous on the subject of his interior life, it is somewhat difficult to know what led him to make this switch. He had already taken pre-medical and law courses, but he had been raised by a minister, an extremely strong-minded one at that, and in an extraordinarily peaceful and protected way. Never, says his father, has Martin known a fuss or a fight or a strike back in the home. On the other hand, there are some things from which no Negro can really be protected, for which he can only be prepared, and Martin Sr. was more successful than most fathers in accomplishing this strenuous and delicate task. I have never believed, he says, that anybody was better than I. That this is true would seem to be proved by the career of his son, who never went around fighting with himself like we all did. Here, speculation is really on very marshy ground, for the father must certainly have fought in himself some of the battles from which young Martin was protected. We have only to consider the era, especially in the South, to realize that this must be true, and it must have demanded great steadiness of mind, as well as great love, to hide so successfully from his children the evidence of these battles. And since salvation, humanly speaking, is a two-way street, I suggest that if the father saved the children, it was almost equally the children who saved him. It would seem that he was able, with rare success, to project onto his children, or at least onto one of them, a sense of life as he himself would have liked to live it, and somehow made real in their personalities principles on which he himself must often have found it extremely dangerous and difficult to act. From King's own account, I can only guess that this decision was aided by the fact that, at Morehouse College, he was asked to lead the devotions. The relationship thus established between himself and his contemporaries, or between himself and himself, or between himself and God, seemed to work for him as no other had. Also, I think it is of the utmost importance to realize that King loves the South. Many Negroes do. The ministry seems to afford him the best possible vehicle for the expression of that love. At that time in his life, he was discovering the beauty of the South. He sensed in the people a new determination, and he felt that there was a need for a new, courageous witness. But it could not have occurred to him, of course, that he would be, and in such an unprecedented fashion, that witness. This next excerpt is about Coretta Scott King. What had really happened in Coretta's case, as in so many others, was that life had simply refused to recognize her private timetable. She had always intended to marry, but tidily, possibly meeting her husband at the end of a triumphant concert tour. However, here he was now, exasperatingly early, and she had to rearrange herself around this fact. She and Martin were married on June 18, 1953. By now, naturally, it is she whom Martin sometimes accuses of thinking too much about clothes. People who are doing something don't have time to be worried about all that, he has informed her. Well, he certainly ought to know. Coretta King told me that from the time she reached Boston and all during Martin's courtship and her own indecision, she yet could not rid herself of a feeling that all that was happening had been, somehow, preordained. And one does get an impression, until this point in the King story at least, that inexorable forces, which none of us really know anything about, were shaping and preparing him for that fateful day in Montgomery. Everything that he will need has been delivered, so to speak, and is waiting to be used. Everything, including the principle of nonviolence. It was in 1950 that Dr. Mordecai W. Johnson of Howard University visited India. King heard one of the speeches Johnson made on his return, and it was from this moment that King became interested in Gandhi as a figure and in nonviolence as a way of life. Later, in 1957, he would visit India himself. And to conclude the essay with our final excerpt, it is the sons and daughters of the beleaguered bourgeoisie supported in the most extraordinary fashion by those old, work-worn men and women who were known only yesterday as the country, who have begun a revolution in the consciousness of this country, which will inexorably destroy nearly all that we now think of as concrete and indisputable. These young people have never believed in the American image of the Negro and have never bargained with the Republic, and now they never will. There is no longer any basis on which to bargain, for the myth of white supremacy is exploding all over the world, from the Congo to New Orleans. Those who have been watched and judged and described for so long are now watching and judging and describing for themselves. And one of the things that this means, to put it far too simply and bluntly, is that the white man on whom the American Negro has modeled himself for so long is vanishing. Because this white man was, himself, very largely a mythical creation. White men have never been, here, what they imagined themselves to be. The liberation of Americans from the racial anguish which has crippled us for so long can only mean, truly, the creation of a new people in this still new world. But the battle to achieve this has not ended. It has scarcely begun. Martin Luther King Jr., by the power of his personality and the force of his beliefs, has injected a new dimension into our ferocious struggle. He has succeeded in a way no Negro before him has managed to do, to carry the battle into the individual heart and make its resolution the province of the individual will. He has made it a matter, on both sides of the racial fence, of self-examination, and has incurred, therefore, the grave responsibility of continuing to lead in the path he has encouraged so many people to follow. How he will do this, I do not know, but I do not see how he can possibly avoid a break, at last, with the habits and attitudes, stratagems and fears of the past. No one can read the future, but we do know, as James has put it, that all futures are rough. King's responsibility, and ours, is to that future which is already sending before it so many striking signs and portents. The possibility of liberation, which is always real, is also always painful, since it involves such an overhauling of all that gave us our identity. The Negro who will emerge out of this present struggle, whoever indeed this dark stranger may prove to be, will not be dependent in any way at all on any of the many props and crutches which help form our identity now. And neither will the white man. We will need every ounce of moral stamina we can find, for everything is changing, from our notion of politics to our notion of ourselves, and we are certain, as we begin history's strangest metamorphosis, to undergo the torment of being forced to surrender far more than we ever realized we had accepted.
Well, there is certainly a lot, and I'm sure that we'll get into a lot of this, but I just wanted to start this conversation by by just by just saying that when I read this essay, I feel like Baldwin is asking a very simple question, which is, as Coretta put it, what manner of man is this? Who is king? Where did he come from? What produced him? What is required to produce a man, produce a revolutionary like king? And I think that he has given us a very straightforward answer, which is the people produced him. The people put him on that stage of history through a struggle. And once he was on that stage, as Baldwin writes, the struggle King was uh, that King was waging and the struggle of the people became the same. Their prayers for a leader were answered. They suddenly realized that they could have a future. They saw the sky with King, and I bring that up to say that I feel like, and this is continuing our last conversation as well. When this when this when King was assassinated, and it's really difficult for me to bring this up. When King was assassinated, I feel like it wasn't just the death of one person, it was the death of an entire people, it was the death of an entire nation and their hopes. And I feel like that is a crime against humanity and against America and against all its people. And it's a crime that we haven't been able to reconcile with or redeem ourselves from. And yeah, I just wanted to start our conversation with that.
Well, the first thing I wanted to say is I'm really glad that the podcast is focusing on this essay because I don't think, well, besides Coretta Scott King's autobiography, I actually think that there's something very special about the way James Baldwin writes about Martin Luther King Jr. Like, I think it's not easy to beat the way Baldwin talks about King because Baldwin somehow, and I think this is something that has always interested me, Baldwin is able to capture Martin Luther King Jr., the man. And not just the man, but accurately describe, for example, those Black people who adored him, and not because he is seen as some sort of god as better than them, but exactly because he is such an exemplary son of theirs. And King does those people so proud. But I think that's worth saying because um, the way Baldwin is able to also accurately describe King's philosophy, like where he comes from, but then also that it must be such a difficult burden for one man to carry. Because we didn't read this part, but there's a in the very beginning, Baldwin makes the point to say, I felt a little bad interrupting Martin Luther King because he's such a famous person. And unlike most famous people I meet, I actually like him because other famous people end up hating themselves because they end up capitulating, basically. And he was like, Martin Luther King Jr. is special, both because he's a preacher I actually like, and he's also a famous man I actually like. And he makes it a point to say, and I felt kind of funny about it, but actually most of my questions I wanted to ask King were not quote unquote political, but actually mainly about his private life. Because in some ways it takes someone like Baldwin, who has also made some extraordinary choices, to be, in his own words, a witness for the truth, a witness of this revolutionary situation, to be able to recognize a fellow revolutionary, a fellow human being who has made extraordinary choices out of his love for the people and out of his love for an American people, half of whom the population do not love him back. Like, it takes someone like Baldwin to be able to accurately describe King, the man. And it's why it's so beautiful in some of the passages we read, the way Baldwin calls King. He doesn't call him King. He says Martin, or he says the young Martin. And he also refers to Martin Luther King as his younger brother, because it's the way Baldwin understands King as like a man who is an ordinary man who is extraordinary, like an ordinary man who has made extraordinary choices. And is a reflection of such an extraordinary movement of ordinary people, like the way the passage Crystal read at the end, like the sons and daughters of a beleaguered bourgeoisie in partnership with the men and women from the country in the South, like, you know, ordinary people marching together to become, in a fight to become a new people in a still new world. And like before, I didn't want to talk too much, but the one other thing I wanted to just talk about is I really enjoy the way Baldwin describes the people of the South as well, the church, like the beauty of the ordinary people, like whether you want to call them working people or poor people who go to church, the way, like, because for someone like me, for example, who both didn't grow up in a church, didn't grow up in a Black church for sure, and definitely did not grow up in a city like Philadelphia, where there is so many beautiful Black churches, like Baldwin is in some ways giving people the gift of seeing, no, man, this is beauty. The way that an ordinary people who don't have much, you know, the way the woman will collect their finest to wear on Sunday, the way the men, they're gleaming sobriety. Like, this is the beauty. Like, this is the beauty of ordinary people. This is the beauty of human beings. And it's exactly these people, the way they organize the church. That this, in some ways, this is what produced King. Like, this is what produced someone like King. And like Baldwin says, it is both King who allows the people to march forward and make such a great commitment to a new country being born. But it is also exactly these people, these ordinary men and women, and that kind of spirit, like the beauty of them, the morality of these people, that also in some ways produced the movement that King became a reluctant leader of.
Yes. Well, building on that, I would like to say, well, first of all, I think that, what Baldwin does is very, very significant, as Emily said, because there were many, even Black intellectuals and radicals and so on in the North, not in places like Montgomery, that were commenting on what was happening and really did not fully appreciate the significance of what was happening. But Baldwin made the courageous choice, I think, to even come back from France and to go to places like Montgomery and to basically be a witness in this way. And also, I was very struck, of course, by his descriptions of Montgomery and the church, as Emily was saying, and in particular, the part where he talks about his relationship with the congregation and the Black people of Montgomery. And so the part where he says, "It is true that it was they," speaking of the people, "who had begun the struggle of which he was now the symbol and the leader. It is true that it had taken all of their insistence to overcome in him a grave reluctance to stand where he now stood. But it is also true, and it does not happen often, that once he had accepted the place they had prepared for him, their struggle became absolutely indistinguishable from his own and took over and controlled his life. He suffered with them, and thus he helped them to suffer." And then he says the joy that filled the church and their prayer, was because it was of a people who have found their prayers for a leader miraculously answered and who know that they can change their situation if they will. And I thought that was a very, very, very significant description of, a person that is basically a description of a revolutionary leader, first of all. And secondly, the way in which in that passage you can appreciate his relationship with the people, that it is basically a dialectical relationship, because essentially what happened, King came to Montgomery. And by the way, he was very young. I was looking into it. He was 25 years old when he came in 1954 and 26 when the Montgomery bus boycott had started. And this group of citizens, I think many women who were part of churches, wanted to do this bus boycott, and they wanted different preachers. And eventually King, as the newest one, he was the one most willing, although a little reluctantly, to take this up. But once he took it up, the way Baldwin discusses how he identified himself fully with it, and he could, even challenge the people to no longer be deluded by anything and to accept this intolerable reality, but that they could act to change it. I mean, that is a very significant thing. And the way in which Baldwin, and throughout, the way in which he discusses his relationship with the people is very important. And for again, as Shantanu said, I mean, this is a theme. What manner of man was this? That he was a very rare Black person that did a PhD from a prestigious university and could have easily had like we'll discuss, I'm sure, later with his father, could have had a career, in many fields or whatever, or even in theology. But he went back south, and that too to Montgomery, which is a place, not even a major city of the South, like Atlanta or Nashville or something. It was Montgomery, totally out of the way place. But the fact that he was willing to apply everything he learned and to identify himself with the people, not see himself separate. I mean, that little town, as far as I know, basically changed American and world history because of what happened.
Yeah, in some ways you can say that Baldwin is like, you can also say that Baldwin, the way he sees King is really special, is able to accurately describe how special it is King and his relationship with people. But in other ways, you could actually say that Baldwin is perhaps the most accurate and significant, what do you want to call it, translator or witness of the Third American Revolution. like the way that Baldwin is able to actually capture the revolutionary quality of this movement. And you can't, and it's something we talk about a lot, which is you can't apply the revolutionary theory of Marx or even Lenin to describe exactly what's happening here in the South, like with the Montgomery bus boycotts, what relationship he has with these people. It is someone like James Baldwin who is able to not just describe how special, how revolutionary this is, but also he's preserving it. Like in some ways, it is exactly this essay that is able to accurately preserve what's happening here, coming from the African American people in the South. And
It looks like Emily has frozen.
sorry.
Yeah, you froze up for a bit. Could you repeat the last couple of sentences?
Oh, I was just saying that the end of the essay, I think it's my favorite part. And I think it's both what Jahan's saying, that how revolutionary this time was, that this was a revolution, but also the way Baldwin is able to basically describe, similar to King, but Baldwin is describing that America, he's saying that America will have to basically achieve a revolution, which is to achieve a people's democracy, like a new nation. And there's something very special about the way Baldwin is even giving you a sense of like history, that America is meant to be on a path towards something more, something complete, something that's not hypocritical, but actually in reality is democracy. And the way Baldwin like gives you the framework with which, like, he's able to give you the framework in which King and this movement is revolutionary, where he says, in fact, there is no such thing as the white man. Like the white man is a myth. And in fact, the myth of there being such thing as a white man is exactly the crutch that people will have to let go of. And it will be a difficult process. But once you can release yourself from racial anguish, then a new people will be able to be born in this still new world. And I think that's why this is something Jahan was pointing to too. But that scene when they're in the church, like how revolutionary that is, where and I'm thinking about it a lot, because I think, like, I've been to a few church services recently, and some of them have been white churches, predominantly white churches. But that part where Baldwin makes it a point to say that what's special about what was happening in the South, especially with King, is that at church, there was the belief that you can change the situation rather than make the situation more tolerable.
Right.
That's very different, because at a white church, for example, like, religion is not used to make you believe that you have the capacity to change the unjust situation. But actually, in fact, especially if it is a white church, you as a white people will not even think there is a situation you're living in. But there's a situation, and it's an unjust system. And actually, you must change it, not make it more comfortable for you to live in.
Right. It's interesting that you say that, because I immediately thought of like the last 2 decades, where there have been the United States has been involved in so many wars, but there has been a kind of silence, and I relate that to just um, being to tolerating something as opposed to actually trying to change something. Like you kind of take something for granted, and then you say, okay, as long as this particular criteria is met, I don't have to worry about anything else. But I think that this is what we were talking about, how King imposes a higher standard of living that he wants you to live up to, a kind of standard that would actually transform America as a whole. And I know this is not a very well formed thought, but I am particularly thinking about how um, you have youth, you still have youth movements, you have leftist movements, you have people fighting for all kinds of things, but what are these things rooted in? What is a concrete philosophy that it's rooted in? And like you said, Emily, everybody goes towards European philosophy and thinks Marx, Lenin and Engels, but they have a revolutionary history here. They have a revolutionary past here. They have King and they have Baldwin, and they have Du Bois and they have Paul Robeson, but nobody's looking to them. And it's just a surprise that why aren't you looking at this? You have fertile ground to lay out your movement, but instead it's the same argument of we need to get socialism, but white socialism. We need to get Marxism, but imported from a bygone era, which doesn't apply to America.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, I just wanted to say because I think something is also being worked out. Kind of going back to what we had started with, and or at least Emily, you brought it up, like the mandate of conscience.
Yeah, conscience.
That's what I said, right? Yeah, sorry. No. But what I mean is that there's the higher law. And I think what's so interesting in what is being worked out is like Jeremiah had commented, something also that stands out to him is that Baldwin describes the prophetic quality of King's upbringing, the formation and emergence as a leader. And it's something about prophecy, history, and time that is also kind of like surrounding in my head. Like, yes, we have the conversation about autobiography and history and things like that, but we have studied Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. We also know what the democratic struggles of the Black proletariat were, which is the struggle for a human freedom, to actualize democracy, for all people. And there's also something that in what King was called to do, or listening to his spirit, and where actually time was pushing him to go towards, that he would either pull from Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, or pull or understand what quality, like why nonviolence is almost inherently an achievement or an advancement to the struggle for democracy in this country in particular. Like there's something like the word prophetic means almost like you can assume or can tell what the future is like, but in a sense prophetic is almost ultimately then connected to what you're saying, Shantanu, which has to be connected to a certain concrete historical struggle of the people, like the, in other words, an actual movement of the people. And I think what you're saying also, Emily, about the difference between a white church and a Black church is interesting. And this conversation about standards is also interesting. In essence, it is true that King was preparing for something that had to be articulated. He might not have articulated what it needed to happen. But that also says two things: that there is a struggle to be had, especially in our time. There is a way to address it, both morally, ideologically, and actually, like in terms of our relationship, meaning America's relationship to the rest of the world, meaning to the crisis that we face. But then there's also kind of like the discussion about what happens to a people in a particular moment. And I think what we're also talking about can help us understand. Like, I think it's one thing to go through like a person's autobiography without a certain contextualization, political and historical contextualization. Because what Jeremiah was also pointing out is that, like, there is a parallel. He said that there is a striking parallel with Baldwin's first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, published before the movement in 1952, which basically prophesizes the rise of someone like King in that generation. Like, there
That's
is a way to
interesting.
understand, like, a group or a people in a particular time. So that means that time isn't something that, is I think time is dependent on the movement of history, the movement of people. History is dependent on what people do, the choices that people make. And because even with Coretta, she decided to go to the school that she ended up at, but she could have chose another school. There's also something in her that wanted to go south. Like, there's something also in a person like who is, I guess, younger, but in Diane Nash, who want to go south to help progress the movement for freedom. And I think what we're also hitting on is how basically, or how essentially, when we're dealing with the moral responsibility, or dealing with a certain how should I say, like we like acknowledgement of the actual reality of either a ruling elite that will murder or will impoverish for their benefit, or if we're actually dealing with, like, like, or if we take seriously, you know what I mean? Like, there's a certain taking of seriously of thought, philosophy, and the role that actually things play with each other, that you can move in a certain direction. You can see where you can make sense of yourself, and you can see where you are almost destined to go. And I think that's the interesting thing that we're pulling out with, like, why King was on a dangerous road, or how he could be produced by a people in potentiality. You know what I mean? Not completely fulfilled, but a desiring to fulfill a certain aspiration. Um,
Hmm.
Right. Yes. Well, I think. I mean, there's obviously so much to discuss with how King saw the future, and even at various parts of his life. And I was also struck by the discussion about about Martin Sr. and the way in which Baldwin
Hmm.
discusses Martin Sr. in relation to Martin Jr. And it is very interesting to discuss prophecy and destiny, because while, of course, we can imagine the ways the future will take and the ways that we feel it must go, we also recognize through the study of people like King that ultimately it is a choice that people must make, and that nothing is guaranteed if we do not have the courage to make those choices and to sacrifice for them, which I think King was also getting at with Beyond Vietnam. But when Baldwin is discussing Martin Sr., Martin Sr. is someone from a very poor background who is basically a self-made man, and who's in a very difficult time in the South, after World War I. In some ways, he says, like, economically, may have been able to take advantage of it, but obviously in terms of race relations and lynchings and all that sort of thing, it was a horrible period. But he is able to make something of himself and give his children a good life. Um, but I found very interesting how you talk about the father-son relationship, and that is something in Baldwin's novels, as well as you all were saying. Um, and he talks about Martin Sr. wanting to protect his children from basically this reality of what is happening with racism and dehumanization, and he wants to raise them believing that
Hmm.
they are not lesser than anyone else. And basically Baldwin comes back to this thing, like, King is a leader who has never went around fighting with himself like we all did. Like, a lot of the older Black leadership is saying that. and kind of marking that out as why he's different. A lot of that is because of the way his father raised him, as well as the period in which he's growing up, as Baldwin is saying, where white supremacy is being challenged on the world scale in a way it was not in the 1920s or 30s when his father was younger. But I thought it was one part I was pretty struck for was when Baldwin says, let's talk about salvation in terms of this relationship of what Martin Sr. wanted for his children. And he says, and since salvation, humanly speaking, is a two-way street, I suggest that if the father saved the children, it was almost equally the children who saved him. It would seem that he was able with rare success to project onto his children, or at least onto one of them, a sense of life as he himself would have liked to live it, and somehow made real their personalities, principles on which he himself must often have found it extremely dangerous and difficult to act. Particularly that second part. Somehow made real in their personalities, principles on which he himself must have often found it extremely dangerous and difficult to act. And that I thought was very, again, profound, because he is saying that Martin Sr. is like many of these Black men that have grown up during slavery, even after slavery, who had to deal with this harsh reality and navigate it and protect their families, and and that has its own kind of agony. But he was able to pass on these principles, and it's very interesting because he may have had a different idea of what it would look like to pass on those principles. He thought maybe that would be King becoming a doctor or a lawyer and maybe moving north, I don't know, being successful in a certain kind of way. But he passed on those principles, but for King, that meant in a way perhaps that his father did not see so concretely, that no, I actually have to come back south and I have to engage in this, very difficult struggle because of, how you raised me. And I just thought that was, there's something very profound there about the love between, parents and children, and how that takes form and how that took form in a person like King. And I totally agree with Emily. The ending of this essay itself is, very, very profound. And it shows you that, what King, in terms of a revolutionary, as Baldwin is saying, he forced this question into the heart of every individual. And Baldwin is basically saying that we all, and when it's interesting, he says we all, which includes Black, white, and everyone, we all are going to have to give up more than we ever realized. And so hence revolution is not this narrow thing of it just going out doing a protest or a strike or whatever. It is going to require everyone to give up a lot, and everyone has to go into their individual heart. And that is the question. Are people who are, supposedly revolutionaries, are they prepared for that in a way? And, the only way you can understand what that means is by looking at the life of a person like King and the way in which a person like Baldwin was a witness to that life.
Because what you said reminded me of that line in what we just read out, where Baldwin writes that he brought the battle and the resolution into everybody's individual will, like making the moral choice extremely clear for everyone. And I also feel like, I know that we have to move on, but I also feel like the way that Baldwin describes King's childhood, and he describes that he's never been fussy, he's never gotten into a fight. I don't know why it makes me feel like he was almost destined to get the philosophy of non-violence. Like he was that person who would get most from this philosophy and be able to harness it and use it. And as Baldwin says, he would be able to bear the light in a space of darkness. It's really interesting how Baldwin spends a significant amount of time in this essay called The Dangerous Road before Martin Luther King, exploring his past and all the relationships that actually formed a man like him. But now I feel like we have to move on and look at our next clip. We have a short clip again from Beyond Vietnam. And if we could play that, please.
This call for worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all mankind. This oft misunderstood, this oft misinterpreted concept, so readily dismissed by the Nietzsches of the world as a weak and cowardly force, has now become an absolute necessity for the survival of man. When I speak of love, I'm not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I'm not speaking of that force which is just emotional bosh. I'm speaking of that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of St. John. Let us love one another, for love is God, and every one that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. If we love one another, God dwelleth in us, and His love is perfected in us. Let us hope that this spirit will become the order of the day. We can no longer afford to worship the god of hate, or bow before the altar of retaliation. The oceans of history are made turbulent by the ever-rising tides of hate. History is cluttered with the records of nations and individuals that pursued this self-defeating path of hate. As Arnold Toynbee says, love is the ultimate force that makes for the saving choice of life and good against the damning choice of death and evil. Therefore, the first hope in our inventory must be the hope that love is going to have the last word, unquote. We are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, that is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked, and dejected with a lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of men does not remain at flood, it ebbs. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is adamant to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. That is an invisible book of life that faithfully records our vigilance or our neglect. Omar Khayyam is right, the moving finger writes, and having writ moves on. We still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. We must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace in Vietnam and justice throughout the developing world, a world that borders on our doors. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time, reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the sons of God, and our brothers wait eagerly for our response. Shall we say the odds are too great? Shall we tell them the struggle is too hard? Will our message be that the forces of American life militate against their rival as full men, and we send our deepest regrets? Or will there be another message of longing, of hope, of solidarity with their yearnings, of commitment to their cause, whatever the cost? The choice is ours, and though we might prefer it otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
Yeah, and that speech we can listen to that for a while. But I know that we have been given something. We were given, all of us, we were given Martin Luther King's life. We were given Martin Luther King's legacy. We're given a certain quality. Um, and I think what's funny about how we ended that previous section with the end of The Dangerous Road before Martin Luther King, because Baldwin had also mentioned that we have to give up more than what we realize we accepted. Because what have we been accepting? Have we been accepting the standards of the white Western world order that incline on a of a deep and a variety of civilizations and their values, Chinese, Indian, African, for their demoralization, for their death? And that's something interesting that King had mentioned. There's something damning about death. There's something damning, something that love has got to have the last word, or a reason for why love has got to have the last word. And why I mention it like that is because we talk about the last white nation, or what it means to exist in a world that has to choose for our morality and for our life, or for our depravity or no future at all. And something also in the necessity of being white also makes it impossible to be human, to be loving. And there's something damning about that too. And I think it's so interesting. America is a place where if you work hard, you get to live well. But what does paying your dues really mean? What does it really mean for you to suffer, to be able to gain? What it would ever mean to love, or to be able to be joyful, or to be in partnership, in this cosmic partnership with humanity. And I think there's something very serious about that, especially, or at least for me.
Oh well, I've been thinking about a few things from the Dangerous Road essay, and also how it relates to this speech that we just listened to. And I'm thinking a lot about like what it means to actually inherit a tradition like this. Like, what is this generation's inheritance, really? And I mean, there is one, like, the individual, understanding like where they come from, their own ancestry, like their own history. And I like being Chinese and growing up in California. Like, it's interesting how in so many ways actually that very experience, that very upbringing, that gave me certain like Chinese civilizational values, that actually is what prepared me to inherit actually this, to inherit King and to inherit this legacy in America. And it's funny, like, it's kind of like what Jeremiah was saying about there being something prophetic about it. And there is this like very organic process of individuals emerging from society, from the people, and like being rooted in a love, a very deep love for the people. And I think that is what King had, that makes him someone that I trust, is that he possesses like a deep revolutionary love of the people, an intimate knowledge of people, black and white. And even in possessing that deep intimate knowledge, he had a faith in the capacity of the human being to make a moral choice. And I think that is like the struggle for our times, is that at this point, what is it that we as the youth, like, what can we really do in America today? America, presents the fact that we like live and in America and that we are Americans, gives like gives us a very unique responsibility, actually, to the world, to history, to time, and to the people of the world, to the future, to the children of the next generation. And I think what is important is that, like King talks about as well, this fierce urgency of now. And we are seeing so many, like, the wars, violence abroad, but also violence at home. And there is a certain, like, lovelessness in our society that Baldwin talks about. And like, in seeing Baldwin and King in conjunction, you can draw parallels between the lovelessness in our society and the violence that we see in the world today. And so, like, with that urgency and with that clarity, King essentially challenges us to not only, like, take on a new moral standard, but we can't afford to be soft-minded. Like, we can't afford to be cowardly anymore. And, like, that is what it's going to take, in a way, to actually, like, be at war with yourself, to reconcile the contradictions within the world and within yourself, and make freedom real.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think you posed the exact question of today, Crystal. That's also the question that we're asking in the upcoming events on Thursday and Saturday, which is, I really like the way you said it, which is, what is this generation's inheritance? But that's also to say, basically, what moral choice will this generation have to make? Because that moral choice is the struggle for our times. I really like the way you said that, because in some ways, that's also why we're talking about Beyond Vietnam for April 4th and 6th, not as a speech of the past, but in fact, a speech that has deep resonance for today. And you brought up both the wars happening with the genocide in Gaza that the U.S. is supporting and backing, as well as Ukraine. And I wanted to underline what you said about only a loveless society, only a country that is loveless and does not love itself goes outside and meddles with the world. Like, it's only a country or society that does not love itself, that will not spend its time nurturing its children, improving things, building a peace economy, building, like, an actual rational, like, good economy, fulfilling democracy, rather than going abroad to try to control a world, so that the world can maintain a certain delusion that America is the best, America's great. And but I just wanted to bring up that I wanted to come back to King's speech Beyond Vietnam, because, Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence. I think today is exactly a time to break silence, which is the question for this Thursday, April 4th, as we honor the actual date that King gave that speech. And I think that we're seeing, with the discontented in America, different forms of expression, that it may be a time to break silence, and there may be a rekindling of King's spirit. Like, we talked about it before, but I wanted to bring up that, with over 1,000 Black preachers signing a letter to President Biden calling for an immediate ceasefire with Gaza, and then also the African Methodist Episcopal Church strongly condemned Israel's genocide, that in some ways we are seeing the American people, different sections of what is a discontented, disappointed, angry, upset people, who maybe for the past decades did not heed King's warning that there is such thing as too late. But what we're seeing today, a rekindling of that spirit of a time to break silence. And I like the way King said at the end of the speech that we may not like that it is like this, but the time has come for us to choose, what Crystal said, to make a certain moral choice for ourselves, but also for the future of a non-existent country that we have to give birth to. And that is the struggle of our times.
Right. Yes. And I think, one of the very significant things in this speech is when he talks about this call for a worldwide fellowship that lives neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing an unconditional love for all mankind. And he discusses how this has often been dismissed by the Nietzsches of the world, but at the same time, when he says that it is the force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life, love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. And I think it's a very interesting contrast that is set up, because on the one side you have the Nietzsches of the world, and sad to say, also many revolutionary intellectuals falling into that trap. And on the other side, you have basically, when he's talking about the great religions of the world, and he names pretty much all of them, he's talking about the majority of the world's people, the ordinary people, for whom, and it's very, if you study, I think, folklore, like at least I've looked into some of the folk traditions of South Asia, is pretty much everything. It doesn't matter. This is the key thing, that people who are illiterate, they understand this point, that love is the ultimate the door to the ultimate reality. Whereas you have people who are, intellectuals and PhDs who don't see this. And King, I think, learned this. Definitely, he obviously studied the Indian struggle and the life of Gandhi, but then in Montgomery, in Selma, and all these places in the South, seeing love underpin the lives of probably all of these ordinary Black people and the sacrifices which they were willing to make. And I think it's very deep that in this moment of agony in 1967, basically at the end of his life, and he knew that he was putting his life in great danger by taking this stand, that he still reaffirms this point, that this is still the central point of my life and the central point moving forward, despite, he went north and he was not welcomed very warmly by people. He was not liked by people, even many of the disaffected Black youth. He saw the horrible violence being done in Vietnam, children being burned, but still he said that love is the way. And, he's very clear that love is not this soft, sort of thing that's commercialized, not a sentimentality. It is actually a very powerful force when it can be harmonized and channeled. And, in that sense, it's very much like Baldwin, and I totally agree with everyone has said. Baldwin made a similar point that all men are brothers. That is the ultimate truth, fundamental truth, that we still have to make a reality. It is not a reality. And at the same time that, what American culture thinks is love has really very little to do with love, and that America is the most unloved country in the world, not by anyone else, by its own citizens. And clearly, one has to start with saying that this is a very ill society. And we all hope that it's reaching a breaking point where people are recognizing that. And we must reject the standards put up, yes, by capitalism, but also by the civilizational values of white supremacy, and that we have to turn towards something else. And this is it, because King's life is also a testament to the fact that one can live a life of love. That's why it's key, and that one can mobilize people on that message. And, in many ways, his ultimate sacrifice bought this country a few more decades, but allowed there to be a country and even a world for us to be born into. The peace movement got some energy from his vision, but clearly it's still incomplete. We're not guaranteed. We had 50 some years from beyond 57, right? From beyond Vietnam. But we're not guaranteed 50 more years if we go down the path that we're going. And that is a stark reality. And so, this is why I totally agree with Emily. This has great significance for today.
I want to briefly touch upon what Serafina and even Crystal said about paying one's dues and what can the youth of today do. And I just want, I'm sort of reminding myself as well that Martin Luther King actually paved a path forward for us. He paid with his life. He died, a revolutionary death, but what he did was make sure that the generations in the future did not have to start from nothing, did not have to start all the way from scratch. He left us a philosophy which Diane Nash called the greatest invention of the 20th century, which is nonviolence. And we can, at any point, pick up this philosophy, pick this struggle back up, continue the civil rights movement, and actually achieve our nation. Because it's not, and I know that a lot of people say the civil rights movement is an incomplete revolution, it's not really a revolution, it's just something that happened for a particular part of people. But no, King was involved in transforming an entire nation, and nonviolence was the way to do it. he would he said that this would transform people, like he called it a strange metamorphosis. And this metamorphosis would not appear out of nowhere. It required sacrifice from people, it required a lot of courage. But once that transformation has been achieved, you would not be concerned with what people do in the present. You would not be concerned with like some actions in the present. When you change a mindset, when you change the consciousness of people towards a non-violent philosophy, it changes your actions forever. Like in the entire future, you would actually only find love and acceptance and brotherhood, and actually have the King's concept of a world house where there's one nation, one people. And I feel like this is what the youth of today has to realize, that we have something that we can pick up right now and do something about it. We can stand up against our government and say that um, enough is enough. We want, as Emily said, a peace economy. We want peace in the world, and if we can, and we can do it non-violently. And if once we achieve that, we can we will start to see changes in our own communities as well.
Yeah, this is why I thought that what also, Crystal, like you said, like the way that you started. I am a Chinese woman from California, or like me, like I'm from Philip. Like though, like it's really an interesting thing that you're saying, Shantanu, which is the fact that the past really, or what we are learning from the, I guess, quote unquote, but meaning to say that the civil rights movement is connected to our time, and the ruling elite had made a deliberate division um, for our literal understanding of that period as it connects to our time. But what's really interesting, or what is really interesting about what you're saying, Emily, about how the moral choice is the struggle for our times. Like it's the moral choice that is the revolutionary choice um, that makes it, or makes this um, re or makes what you're saying, Shantanu, about how do we pick up a certain struggle, even to the question of how would one even pay our dues? How would I pay my dues? Complicated as much as it is simple. Like, what is the moral thing to do? Um, but the thing is also like what is in the path. And I think what's interesting is how we've set up the year of Baldwin based off of the framework of the literacy campaigns, the importance of education. It's actually kind of interesting because morality is also something that you teach. Morality is also something that you, like we've been saying before. King is a certain moral standard, an example. But I think to what you're saying though, Shantanu, is how to be moral now, how to be, like, the thing with revolutionary is like the aspiration that I know that all people in a certain state, in many points of a person's life, would at least kind of think about, because there's a desire to achieve a certain understanding emotionally, maturity. There's a desire to achieve maturity. But the thing with being a revolutionary is all complicated by whether it be our chronological standpoint, how we view ourselves in history, or how we view ourselves in our thinking. Who teaches us, and for what do they teach us that makes them get what they want? Which is the only way I can only put that is when I know that there is a crisis of the ruling elite that want to use education as propaganda rather than education to advance intellectual curiosity or to advance civilization. But the point is that to achieve that sense where the moral is connected to the concrete manifestation of a historical motivation, like the historical necessity to move or to actualize, like we had said, or what Emily you had pointed out about the nature of time. We would want it to ebb and flow, for time to pause, but on her passage, time is adamant and rushes on. For us to join with those flows instead of, in essence, being sidelined or being washed ashore because of a misgiving or you've missed a certain mark. Because the thing is that in a lot of ways, we are conflicted with this thing of the colony of time and the empire of eternity. The situations of the present and the problems of the present, as well as the problem to manifest or to think about what we were calling the mandate of consciousness, or what is true. Like there's issues on how we are able to verbalize or put language to it. But I think the thing is that we do have to kind of, like what you had mentioned, Emily, deal with the internal instead of going external. And that is both in the person as well as the country. And I think the process is longer than to be said, because the process is human. It's all of us. It's all of what we have also struggled in a certain sense, what I have struggled to even, because the thing about what I've been thinking about also is like, how have we come to King? How have we come, like you have said, Crystal, to our inheritance, to understanding it, to feeling it within ourselves, really? And maybe we were scared to not articulate it to our friends, or maybe we weren't scared, but at some point we had to. And maybe it was weird because, why are you acting like a 40-year-old? Or like, why are you not why are we not on the same why can't we speak the same language? Because my language is not, I don't want my language to be the ruling class. Like, I don't want my culture, I don't want my art to be contained in the same standards I want to be free. Like, that's the thing. And I think in order to be moral and in order to maybe even do all of that, it has been an emotional, spiritual like you gotta go through it. And that's not easy. The thing about that I want to say is this thing about fear, because I think that what we're also trying to confront is what you had mentioned. With King, there's light, there's the light, and you can see it, or at least you can use it, you can feel it in your heart. But even at that alone, there can be moments of fear or moments of darkness. And as long as I guess we illuminate that there is a light, then we can have a certain strategy, or we can move in a certain way forward. But the thing about fear is that it complicates a person to think about what either we're saying right now in this podcast, or what we will continue to learn while we are doing our events. Maybe somebody will jump up and say, well, King is an integrationist. Or, like all of these Indian, Chinese, I don't even see one Black person, like what You know what I'm saying? But the thing about that is that, or the thing about that is it also it illuminates something specific. We do still say that king is, or like king is my father, or king is a father to a new nation, but it's almost like we were working in spite of a lot. But in addition to being in spite of, we have a certain goal, like a certain standard to achieve. And as long as we hold on to that, like this is the thing that I've been pulling on from Baldwin, like this thing about that quote where, like lovers, you hold on to each other. Like I think it is true that when people let go of a certain faith in other people, that's also when all things are lost. But I wanted to mention that because, and I know like we're pressing time, but I had wanted to mention that because I think the thing about really all the things that we're saying is that it is a very much of a spiritual and personal struggle, and it isn't supposed to be easy, but none of it is, you know?
Yeah, it's not. I think that I think last time we listened to Diane Nash saying that freedom is not something that once you have it, you've got it. It's something that you have to continuously strive for and struggle for. It's a process and it's a long one. The ideological struggle is long and hard, you know. And another thing that Serafina said reminded me of, you know, how you said that like lovers, you hold on to each other. There's one, there's an essay by Baldwin called The Creative Process, where he says that the artist's war with society is like a lover's war. If you love your society, you will fight it to make it change for the better. And I feel like King also says something very similarly. He loved America, he loved the South, but he wanted to see, he had a vision for a new America, which is why, you know, we call him the father of a new American people, because he was. And I feel like we have gone significantly over time, but I would just like to ask all our guests if they have any closing comments. After this, we will move on to the conclusions. Okay. So, oh yeah, go on.
Oh, well, I think I just wanted to conclude in talking about the youth, and specifically for this generation. Like, I just want to like clarify and underscore that, you know, like I didn't grow up learning about King. Like none of us really grew up learning about King. Or if we did have a certain understanding of King, it was a misunderstanding of King, like seeing King as a pacifist, or like Serafina, what you brought up, as an integrationist. And I really do think that this generation, our generation, is under constant assault, really ideological assault, but also, you know, on our physical bodies. And it impacts everything. It impacts our relationships. It impacts like our dreams, you know, our imagination as to what we really aspire towards, what we think is possible. And King, in a lot of ways, like the more you read about him, the more you learn about him, it becomes obvious as to why the ruling elite would want to smear his name and his legacy. And it is because he essentially advocates for the complete opposite of what our culture pushes us towards. And, you know, like even looking at like the way this generation consumes media today, like more and more towards short form content, like increasingly lower attention spans, the mental health crises that's amongst the youth, and yeah, just along with, you know, the financial and all of that, right? Questions that the youth already have from beginning, existential questions. Like King actually is able to answer them and provide a kind of sustenance for the soul, that one gives you a certain clarity as to what is the moral choice, and 2, also gives you the strength to make that moral choice. And those 2 things are like what you need, essentially. And so, like, I think something like free school, at least for me, like finding the free school was so pivotal. It was like a light bulb went off. And like when you actually look at the lives of people like King, Baldwin, Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Henry Winston, John Coltrane, you know, the list goes on. It gives you a certain clarity as to like what is really important in this life. What does it actually mean to live a life that is for real good, you know, that actually has future generations in mind. Yeah, and it's definitely not like something that happens overnight. It's not something that happens quickly, but I think it's more important now than ever before that we question everything, that we don't take anything for granted.
Okay, with Johan, would you like to?
Yeah, I just wanted to very briefly, just say, I mean, as Shantanu said earlier, King's assassination is a crime, and in many ways, there's been a double assassination. Obviously, the physical assassination, and then there's been a horrible attempt at ideological assassination and smearing, and we are basically challenging people to reject that. And I like what Serafina said earlier about that we have to reject the ruling class's culture, its ideas, everything, in the same way King did. I mean, he rejected its culture, its ideas, even its understandings of religion, its understandings of love, and in that sense was a complete revolutionary. And what just came to mind was what Diane Nash, she quoted her ex-husband James Bevel discussing the way America remembers King and saying, imagine if the Wright brothers, all we did was make up one day of the year where we were like, oh, the Wright brothers were amazing people, and we never used the actual airplane that they invented. In the same way, that's what we reduced King to. And when we actually implement King's idea of society and humanity, that will be the real revolution. And I think the free school is challenging all people in this society to grapple with the reality of King and take on that task.
Thank you, Jahan. That was a very deep way to end this podcast. I want to thank everybody for being a part of this, all our guests, all the people who commented, and of course, everybody who are behind the scenes, who are working their magic, making sure everything goes smoothly. We will now end this podcast episode, but before we go, again, a reminder that we have our King event coming up on April 4th, Thursday, 5 to 8 p.m. at the First Unitarian Church, and 6th April, Saturday, at Zion Baptist Church from 12 to 6. We hope to see you all there, whether online or in person. And the next episode of the podcast will be held on April 28th, where we will return with a new segment of the podcast where we will be discussing James Baldwin and a lot more of his ideas. So till then, take care and goodbye.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
me home. When my way grows